Well, welcome again to the Benefice of East Clevedon as we reflect on the readings for the 6th Sunday of Trinity. The readings today from Genesis chapter 18 verses 20 to 32, which is the occasion of Abraham praying to God to save Sodom and Gomorrah. And then the Gospel of St Luke chapter 11 verses 1 to 13, which is when Christ is teaching his disciples to pray. First of all with the familiar words of the Lord's Prayer, and then with the beautiful words, "So I say to you, ask, and it will be given to you. Search, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, everyone who searches finds, and for everyone who knocks, the door will be opened." Really beautiful words. So both of these readings are about prayer. First of all, a very Jewish prayer, really. Obviously in Genesis, as Abraham pleads for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Here, the towns are about to be destroyed because of their sinfulness. And Abraham pleads with God, argues with him. If we find 50 righteous people, will you save it? Yes, God says. If we find 40 righteous people, will you save it? Yes, says God. If you find 30, will you save it? If they're just 20, will you save it? And so eventually he finds just 10, righteous people. So Abraham prays and wrestles with God. And then in Luke, the disciples ask to be taught how to pray. And Jesus says, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come." The words of the Lord's Prayer. The main thing, though, is perseverance. Tells this little parable, "Do not bother me, the door's already been locked, my children will be in bed." But even though he will not get up and give him anything because he's a friend, at least because of his persistence, he will get up and give him whatever he needs. Well, I think many people, all of us, I'm sure, from time to time, it's a very common experience that praying can be quite a hard activity. Sometimes we feel much more connected with God than at others. Hence, these readings are both about persistence. What happens when our prayers don't appear to be answered, or where we just don't feel like it very much? Where the whole thing seems alien and difficult. Well, as people have said, Christianity is 90% perspiration and 10% inspiration. So there's a huge benefit in keeping going even when things are hard. But to keep going even when things are hard, one has to have some sort of regular routine practice. And there's one piece of advice I would give. It's that in season, out of season, you sort of commit yourself to the idea of God and you keep going. And I'm going to read you something in a few moments' time, which I think is a great encouragement about that. But other than a sort of persistence and a dedication is probably a better word to our prayers, I think the other little piece of advice I would give is pray as you can, not as you can't. Prayer, when it's simply about a sort of almost meaningless list of things, sort of faraway places one knows nothing about, issues one doesn't know about, people one's never heard of, it can be incredibly hard to keep that going for us. And so the question is, what would you like to pray for? And then an even better question is, what is prayer for me? Prayer for me is allowing oneself simply to be aware of God's presence. That's all it is. It's no more complicated or simple than that. It is allowing oneself to be in God's presence, assuming that he knows everything on one's mind. It isn't about creating a list of things to ask for. It is simply coming with our hearts and minds as we are, and then allowing ourselves to be aware of God's presence. Now that can take some time, and why it's coming to a church building can be really helpful. The church buildings are designed, the whole point of them is that they're here to reflect what we believe. And it can be much easier in a church building to allow oneself to be in God's presence. But you can allow yourself to be in God's presence absolutely anywhere. In your kitchen, in your garden, anywhere you can allow yourself to be in God's presence. So prayer is valid wherever you are. But really the heart and soul of it is that you want to do it. In learning how to do anything, there are two principles in learning how to do anything. One, because you have to learn it, or secondly, because you want to learn it. Those two things. So sometimes our prayers are prayers when we have to pray. Something really urgent has happened, something really important has happened to our lives, and we sort of plead for assistance and help. Sometimes it's because we simply want to. We want to make sense of our lives. We want to bring a basket of things to God about us, about our loved ones, whatever it may be. But it's not just merely coming with a list. It's not merely that. It's allowing ourselves to come and to be aware of God's presence. And then all of these other things can be held in our prayers. In our churches, one of the things we do is to allow people to take a pebble and to drop it into water. And I like that analogy of prayer. That one comes as one is, a bit like a pebble, if you like, and submerged in the presence of God. That is what I think a very good analogy of what prayer is. So rather than sort of describing the pebble going down into water, you simply allow it to happen. So you allow yourself to be in God's presence, and then you just come with whatever is on your mind, whatever your hopes, dreams, aspirations for yourselves and for others. And yes, also some simple requests. I want this to be done. I want this to be done. I want this to be healed. I want this to feel better. So the words encouragements of Christ is that if you want to pray, if you want to, then this will happen. Ask, and it will be given to you. Knock, and the door will be open to you. Seek, and you will find. Those are the words of Christ, because these are disciples who want to pray. So I wonder whether you do. So can I come back to this, what happens when our willingness, our wanting to pray has dried up? That's the hardest part. To which my one piece of advice is keep going, because the dry phase won't last forever, I promise. Keep going. And the practice of praying, the practice of allowing yourself to practice your faith, your Christianity, will carry you through to when life is a little easier. There's this lovely reading, and I'll read it to you now. This is a reading about a man who's Christian, and he's a settled, stable, highly intelligent person, very much at the heart of Christian faith, really, a professor of Christian history and all the rest. And a close friend of his died, and his bereavement sat on him so much that he found it really hard to ask God for anything, to search for God, even to want God. I think that's the point. But his commitment to practice his faith carried him through. So let me just read you this. It's about someone called Eamon Duffy. Professor Eamon Duffy, Cambridge Christian historian, tells of how one day his faith collapsed. He had been a happy, practicing Christian, and then a friend of his, a priest, died, and he was plunged into darkness. There was the horror of death. And then this is what Eamon Duffy says. And with the horror came the realization that God was gone. There was no God, I had no faith. All the conditioning, all the arguments, emotional scaffolding I'd built around and into my life were as if they had never been. I no longer believed, no longer even wanted to believe. I was absolutely mesmerised by this overwhelming perception of mortality. I'd never been much good at prayer, and now even more, prayer seemed hollow. I felt confused and embarrassed by my attempts to pray, like a man caught talking to himself in a railway carriage. But when faith returned, it came as a gift. I knew that I had to choose between a bleak and valueless world and one in which love and forgiveness and celebration were possibilities. I do not have much recollection of the process by which I made my choice, except that when it dawned on me that I'd made it, it seemed not so much as a choice as a gift. As I sat after communion one Sunday, simply looking at the people walking up to the altar, I was quietly overwhelmed with an overflowing sense of companionship, of gratitude, of joy, and oddly of pity. My mind filled up, quite literally filled up, with a single verse of the Psalms. Lord, how I love the beauty of your house and the place where your glory dwells. I love that account because I think it's true, and I think it's real, and I think it's a common experience that people are sometimes holding on to their faith by their fingernails. But what also it shows is this is the gift of the desire to pray, but also the benefit of carrying on, practicing one's faith, coming to church, receiving communion, reading scriptures, carrying on even when you don't feel like it, because that's what carries you through. The heart and soul of this, though, is to want it. You either have to need it or want it. And so prayer is a choice, not a requirement. So Jesus says, if you like, if you want, I'm inviting you to ask, and it will be given to you. Search, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, everyone who searches finds, and for everyone who knocks, the door will be opened. Those are not my words, those are the words of Jesus of Nazareth. So let's finish with the collect for today. Merciful God, you have prepared for those who love you such good things as pass our understanding. Pour into our hearts such love toward you that we, loving you in all things and above all things, may obtain your promises which exceed all that we can desire. Through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord.